The story of women in America begins in the first British colonies in the early 17th century. Most early colonial women settled in the New England colonies, especially in the Massachusetts Bay. Initially, the northern colonies were more focused on family life than the southern colonies. As time went on, women migrated to all 13 of the original colonies. Almost all colonial women married early. Most were wed by age 20. Birth rates were high, as was infant mortality. On average, a woman would have a child every 2 years after marriage. Colonial families consisted of an average of 9 children. Of these, 6 would be expected to reach adulthood. Because of the risks of childbirth, a high percentage of births resulted in death for the mother. Colonial women were responsible for washing clothes, cooking meals, and keeping up with housework. Above all, they raised the children, instilling morality and religious values in them. Women in colonial society were seen as inferior to men, though to varying degrees. In the southern colonies, married women were entitled to retain property rights. In contrast, women in New England gave up their property rights upon marriage. In all colonies, women were able to inherit their husbands' estates and were provided some protections. The Puritan ideology that was present in many colonies promoted the subjugation of women to their husbands and fathers. Women were seen as weaker than men, both morally and intellectually. A woman was expected to serve her husband. Girls in colonial society could not attend school as boys could. Some wealthy families, however, hired private tutors to give their daughters a basic education. As time progressed, life for colonial women began to improve. Spousal abuse became a punishable offense. Adultery became one of the few offenses that allowed for divorce. Marriage integrity was upheld by both law and religion. In the 17th and 18th centuries, women did not hold jobs. However, certain realms of society were considered women only. Childbirthing was one of these areas. Midwifery became an outlet for some colonial women. Many other women were servants. They lived harsh lives completely at their master's whims. Indentured female servants from England were bound to servitude until age 24. A servant woman could not marry without her master's blessing and faced an additional 2 years of service if she became pregnant. As America began to desire its independence from Britain, women helped facilitate the American Revolution. With the boycott of many British goods due to increased taxation, American women were the ones who struggled. They helped make the boycott easier for the men by altering their families' meals and making do with the ingredients they had. The Daughters of Liberty were made famous by advocating homespun cloth and clothing, which they made in their own homes. While no women were knowingly drafted into the army once war broke out, many women were forced to defend their families. With men out on the front lines, women were often the only line of defense between their families and the hostile Native Americans and British soldiers. At the beginning of the 19th century, not much had changed in the role of women from colonial times. They were still regulated to the home and were expected to take care of the children. Birth rates remained high. The idea of Republican motherhood emerged during this period in order to assure women that their roles in society were indeed important. Republican motherhood was the idea that as the primary caretaker, a mother played a vital role in passing on the values of society to her children. Later, this idea was extended to create the cult of domesticity, which glorified housework and established a sphere of influence for women separate from the public life of men. Women were expected to be in control of this domestic sphere by taking care of the kids, maintaining a happy household, and catering to their husbands' needs. Things began to change with the Industrial Revolution. Industrial jobs provided more opportunities for young girls and unmarried women. The most famous example of industrial job opportunity is the Lowell Mill from Massachusetts that hired hundreds of Lowell girls to work the machines. When the Second Great Awakening rolled by in the 1830s and 40s, women often formed the charitable arm of the new churches that emerged. For example, the Relief Society of the Church of Latter-day Saints was primarily spearheaded by women. Also, religion inspired many to organize other reform movements, including the temperance movement. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, led by Carrie Nation and Frances Willard, advocated an end to the social evil of alcoholism from a theological standpoint. Women led the temperance movement mostly because they were the direct victims of alcoholism. They wanted to end the domestic violence and economic loss that their husbands perpetuated by getting drunk at local pubs. Near the middle of the 19th century, the suffragist and abolitionist movements gained momentum. Both of these causes were intertwined, since both women and slaves had been languishing in a secondary status. By teaming up with abolitionists, women could effectively argue for equal rights for all and galvanize the suffragist movement. Prominent female abolitionists in the mid-1800s were Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott were also two suffragists who advocated abolition. Along with Susan B. Anthony, they organized the first Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 to discuss women's voting rights. Any progress that had been made by 1860 was destroyed when the Civil War broke out. Women were effectively told to wait in line for their rights when Congress passed the 15th Amendment in 1870. Another example of reform led by women is penal reform. Dorothea Dix improved prisons and mental health treatment. As the century came to a close, women saw more opportunities outside the home. They joined fields like medicine as nurses and doctors. Clara Barton was a famous Civil War-era nurse who later founded the American Red Cross. Elizabeth Blackwell was the first female physician. Also, education facilities opened up to train women for jobs in higher-paying industries. Women like Catherine Beecher and Mary Lyon advocated education for girls, while universities like Vassar College and Mount Holyoke College opened up solely for females. Some important women in this time period include the Grimke sisters, who were the first female speakers in favor of abolition, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, stirred up passions regarding slavery. After the Gilded Age, America propelled into an era of activism known as the Progressive Era. This time was filled with muckrakers who sought to undo the evils of the previous era, and it was women who often took up these roles. One of the driving forces for these women was the social gospel movement, which advocated social reform work. For example, one major social gospel reformer was Jane Addams. Addams founded settlement houses, called Hull Houses, which served as centers of daycare and teaching for immigrant children. Addams eventually won a Nobel Prize for her efforts. Likewise, women like Ida Tarbell stepped out to expose the ruthlessness of major business, and Florence Kelley to expose poor working conditions. Women also continued to fight for women's suffrage during this era. The initial leaders of the effort, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, were succeeded by figures like Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. During this time, Burns and Paul formed the National Women's Party, a competing party to the original, but more conservative, National American Women's Suffrage Association. In the NWP, women used more aggressive tactics like picketing, hunger strikes, and parades to promote their cause, and eventually their efforts paid off, and President Wilson passed the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. With the development of World War I, women were allowed to serve in the military, forming the WAAC and Yeomen, along with opportunities as nurses or operators. Women also worked in some wartime factories. During the 1920s, people like Margaret Sanger became advocates for a woman's right to birth control. Sanger developed the American Birth Control League to promote pregnancy education and prevention. Sanger was also an advocate of the flapper movement. Women used the flapper movement to rebel against their traditional domestic perception by drinking, smoking, dancing, wearing makeup, and participating in other unwomanly activities. During the Great Depression, most women returned to the role as homemaker because their husbands often left to find work, leaving them home alone with the children. Yet outside, in the political world, women were making great strides. Eleanor Roosevelt is known for increasing the role of the First Lady by voicing her opinions and promoting various social issues during this time. Likewise, Frances Perkins became the first female cabinet member as Secretary of Labor. World War II also gave women a larger role in society. On the home front, women worked at ammunition factories. From 1941 to 1945, there was a 6 million increase in the number of women in the workforce. These women's hard work is illustrated by the figure of Rosie the Riveter. After the war, there was a large suburbanization movement that shifted the role of women. Now, instead of working factory jobs, most were replaced by men and instead stayed home to raise their children. Thus, the culture of the 1950s revived the idea of the cult of domesticity, even advertising the role of homemakers in the various new consumer products and television shows, making women more subservient than ever. The women of the 60s fought to change their status, and the era became dominated by the women's liberation movement. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, had a large influence in this movement. Women in this generation also fought for equality in education, workplaces, and politics. Women joined to form the National Organization for Women to pursue this equal opportunism. This decade of women's push eventually paid off. Women gained equal employment opportunity with the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972, equal treatment within schools with the Title IX ruling, and the right to abortion after the ruling in Roe v. Wade.